Good morning, everybody. Whoa, volume is up on this. Well, thanks for joining us this morning. I know the weather or the traffic is a little bit slow, and we'll expect to have a few more folks join us. But on behalf of the Air Force Association and the Mitchell Institute, we're very glad to have you here this morning. I think we'll find a really great speaker and a great session this morning as we discuss trends in air-to-air combat with Dr. John Stillion. My name is Mark Barrett. I'm the Executive Vice President of AFA, and we're very glad to have you here. You know, air superiority is a core mission of the United States Air Force, as it is to Air Forces around the world. I know a little bit about air superiority. I spent some time flying the F-15C, which was by far the finest air-to-air aircraft I've ever had the pleasure of flying, until we built another one, the F-22, and I got a chance to go fly that, which is even better. But you know, we're at a crossroads, at least in the United States Air Force. Most of the airplanes in our military, both Air Force, Navy, Marines, are what we call fourth gen. Really, really, really good airplanes, but against an anti-denial, anti-access, really, really tough. The United States Air Force and the department didn't build enough F-22s, in my humble opinion, and so we have this gap as we're waiting for the F-35 to come along. Now, F-35 is going to be a great airplane, I really believe that, but it was always envisioned to be a partner with the F-22, kind of big brother and little brother as they go out and dominate the skies, not only air-to-air but air-to-ground. So it's really, really tough now to figure out where we are with that and where we're going, and I think today we're going to get a little bit of that insight. It's my pleasure to introduce CSBA Senior Fellow and longtime Mitchell friend, Dr. John Stillion, to present his findings from a report he recently drafted on the subject. John is a senior fellow at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments. He's a former U.S. Air Force officer, instructor navigator, and tactical aviator. He's a distinguished graduate of the Air Force ROTC, United States Air Force Navigator Training, and the RF-4C Tactical Aircrew Training, and he previously worked with the RAND Corporation, where he led multidisciplinary study teams and analyzed a wide range of issues related to air power and future warfare, and has held senior analytical positions in the defense industry. Please help me welcome John Stillion.
Thanks, Mark. Well, before we jump into this, I want to thank both the Air Force Association and the Mitchell Institute for hosting this event today. And I want to thank all of you for coming out. I know it wasn't easy to get here. And I know there's a lot of interest in this topic, so we'll go ahead and start moving at this point. And if you didn't get a report, my colleague Brendan Cooley's in the back. You're welcome to take as many as you want until they're all gone. If you need more, let us know. And it's also available online now in PDF format for download. So, all right, here we go. This is sort of a bottom line up front. I would argue that the objective of air-to-air combat has been constant since it first emerged early in the First World War. And it really can be summed up in the way that the U.S. Air Force sums it up now, which is first look, first shot, first kill. And what that boils down to is superior situational awareness has always been the key to victory in air-to-air combat. Situational awareness is really a function of what kind of sensors you have, what kind of external communication capability you have, and the degree to which you need information or can deny it to the enemy is largely driven by the weapons capability that you have, or how close you have to get to the other guy in order to surprise him and kill him. In the gun era and the early missile era, and we'll talk about what those are a little bit more as we go forward, speed and agility were really crucial. Why is that? Well, essentially, up until the mid-1960s, the airplane was the weapon. Certainly for gun-armed fighters, their purpose was to carry a gun to a very particular part of the sky where it could be employed against the airplane you were trying to shoot down. That also applied for early heat-seeking missiles. It had pretty limited engagement envelopes and things of that nature. You really had to be able to put your airplane in the right place at the right time in order to kill the other guy. As the missile era went along, that began to change somewhat as both missile, sensor, and off-board support capabilities increased, and we'll talk about that as we go forward. So improvements in sensor range, missile range, and the reliability of missiles and networks have, as you'll see, vastly expanded typical engagement ranges over the last 50 years. I put together a database of every air-to-air kill I could find since 1965, which is about 1,450 air-to-air victory claims from a variety of different nations and conflicts. Most of them over the past 20 years have been achieved with long-range weapons with very minimal maneuvering and not a lot of people driving around at supersonic speeds and things like that. As a result of these improvements, platform speed and maneuverability at least seem to me to become less important as sensor and weapon ranges expand. And over the long term, these trends seem to point towards other attributes becoming relatively more important compared to what we traditionally think of as fighter-type attributes, which would be speed, agility, and things like that. So we'll talk about how I came to all those conclusions as we move forward. But it turns out that if sensors, networks, and weapons are kind of increasingly the keys to victory through superior situational awareness, then what you may want is an airplane that can carry bigger sensors, bigger weapons, better network access. And if that's true, then you may want a bigger airplane than a smaller airplane, which is kind of weird. But we'll talk about that too. Let's go to the next chart. Oh, I can do that. All right. So from 1915 to about 1980, as I said, the aircraft was the weapon. Very soon after World War I started, it turns out aerial reconnaissance, which is my old specialty back when I was flying the mighty RF-4C, became very important, particularly after the trench lines hardened in late 1914. Cavalry couldn't do their traditional reconnaissance task because they couldn't make it through the trench lines. So in order to provide the information that the commanders needed, you had to fly over the top of those. And it very rapidly turned out that denying that information to the other side became important, just like acquiring it for yourself became important. And as a result, people started carrying things up in the air to try to stop other people from looking into their battle lines and things like that. So early on, you had things like shotguns, revolvers, rifles, and things like that. Very quickly, within a matter of months, you wound up with airplanes carrying machine guns. Initially, these were operated by an observer in a two-seat airplane, but early airplanes made out of cloth and wood and wire didn't have a lot of payload capacity. So adding an additional person plus the gun made them less agile, which made it difficult to catch the airplanes you were trying to either escort or prevent from doing something. So as a result, very quickly again, you wind up with single-seat fighters with weapons that can fire through the propeller arc. And what that means is that instead of trying to aim my weapon at the opposing enemy aircraft, what I'm going to do is I'm going to aim my aircraft. So the airplane is the weapon, and it stays that way for about 50 years until the introduction of missiles in the mid-1960s. It's really tough to achieve an effective firing position against an alerted opponent, particularly early on when the effective range of the early machine guns was on the order of 50 to 75 meters. You had to get very close to somebody in order to do enough damage to the airplane to bring it down quickly. So if your opponent is alerted and maneuvering, because you, as most of you know, you have to be maneuvering in the same plane, you have to be in range, you have to be in lead in order to hit the guy, right? So what that means is it's way better, in the opinion of most of the really high-scoring aces from World War I on, to sneak up on the other guy and shoot him before he knows you're there. Guys like Eric Hartmann and Gerhard Barkhorn, both of whom had more than 300 kills on the Eastern Front during World War II, developed what they called ambush tactics. And the idea there was, I'm going to seek a position of advantage, I'm going to swoop down, shoot somebody, come back up, reassess the situation. And in fact, Hartmann came up with a kind of a four-word acrostic, if you will, very similar to the OODA loop that Boyd came up with in the 1950s in order to describe what he was thinking about there. Ultimately, it was, how do I have better situation awareness than you and swoop in and kill you? Richard Bong and McGuire out in the Pacific developed very similar tactics. They called them boom and zoom tactics. Again, they're looking for an advantage where they can swoop down, shoot somebody, get back up, assess the situation, recover their SA, and then go back down if they want to or not. All of those guys viewed maneuvering air combat as a high-risk, low-payoff activity that you don't want to get involved in. And one of the reasons for that is it takes so much concentration when you're involved in a maneuvering fight to attempt to hit your opponent that you rapidly lose track of all the other airplanes in the airspace, and some unobserved guy is going to come in and kill you. Even if you're Eric Hartman or Garrett Barkhorn, it doesn't really matter. If you can't see the guy or don't see the guy, he can still kill you. Post-Vietnam, the U.S. Air Force did a study called Red Baron, actually did 3 different versions of it. And in Red Baron 3, what they found after a detailed examination of over 100 air-to-air combats, that about 80% of those resulted from what they called an unalerted victim being attacked before they realized there was even a threat to them. So again, what you see here kind of through the whole thing is that something on the order to 80 to 90% of the kills that have been achieved in air combat up to that point were against unalerted opponents, or you had a really big situational awareness advantage over your opponent. All right. So as I alluded to earlier, I've got a little more than 1,400 confirmed missile era kills of fixed-wing airplanes by other fixed-wing airplanes. Things I did not include in the database are damaged, probables, helicopters, and UAVs. So these are fixed-wing airplane versus fixed-wing airplane engagements. It's hard to say how reliable any air-to-air kill database is. I worked really hard to make sure that I didn't have any duplications and didn't take anything that seemed completely implausible. Some of the database that's out there is really very good. So, for example, there's a pretty comprehensive list that's been published of all the U.S. losses in Vietnam, and I compared that list to the list in my database, and it turns out it's pretty good. So that part of the database, I've got tail numbers, bureau numbers, guys' names, all that stuff, for both the U.S. and many of the Vietnamese. Other entries are a little bit less detailed, but all of them still have the date, the shooter type in terms of airplane, the shooter pilot's name, the victim type of airplane, and the type of weapon used. You can make all that up, but what we're looking for here is trends. The evidence that's out there indicates that all air forces overclaim. If you look at kind of what people claim to have done versus what actually happened, British claims in France during the Battle of France from May 10th through 21st, 1940, 499 German airplanes. If you look at the actual German losses, the Germans are very good record keepers, and their quartermaster of the Luftwaffe actually had to account for all the lost airplanes. They lost 299, and that's to both French and British airplanes. So you're looking at an overclaim ratio, something on the order of 2 to 1 there. Studies from World War II indicate that U.S. fighter pilots overclaimed by a factor of about 2. And then I actually went back and looked at F-86 versus MiG-15 combats for about the first 6 or 7 months that the F-86s were introduced to the Korean conflict. At that time, everybody on the other side was a Russian pilot. Most of those guys had World War II experience, just like our guys. They were flying very similar airplanes. Both sides thought they were beating the crud out of the other dudes, right? So they both thought that they were winning significantly because they both overestimated the damage they were doing to the other side. Turned out it's about a 1.3 to 1 kill ratio in favor of the U.S. So both sides were overestimating the amount of damage they were doing by about a factor of 2.5. So we're able to tell that now because, again, the Russians were very meticulous in keeping track of airplanes lost and all of that. And their records were opened up in the 90s. So having said all that, what we're looking for is trends. So there may not have been, probably weren't 1,450 airplanes actually shot down here, but the underlying trends are likely to remain even if we're off by a factor of 2 in terms of magnitude of numbers. All right, let's talk a little bit about the human eye as a sensor. That was the primary sensor for air-to-air combat for the first 50 years or so of air combat. So if you take a look at this, in order to actually see an airplane at a significant distance, you have to look at it with about the 2-degree wide central portion of your vision. Have people been able to see airplanes at significant distances? Yes, particularly if you're cued. There are people who say, well, I've been doing a tanker rendezvous and I've been able to pick out the tanker at 20 or 30 miles. Yeah, that's because you got an air TACAN or something like that that limits your search area to a very small piece of the sky that you can scan through with your little 2-degree cone and you can pick it out, or maybe there's a wing flash or something like that. It turns out that to reliably detect another airplane, and I won't take you through all of this because all of you can read, you're basically limited to about a 2 nautical mile space around your airplane that you can effectively search and make sure that there's no enemy aircraft in it. And it's a little bit bigger behind the airplane, a little smaller in front, and that has to do with timing for the most part. So I won't get into that in too much detail. It's all in the report in the interest of time. So again, from about 1915 to about 1980, the aircraft was the weapon. But in 1965, for the first time, air-to-air missiles began to be used in a sustained way in aerial combat in Vietnam. And you can see the types of missiles that were used here on the underside of this lovely McDonnell Douglas Demon airplane. You've got beyond visual range missiles that were available, radar-guided, AIM-7 Sparrows, and you've got IR missiles. The most successful early on was obviously the Sidewinder. Other types existed. One of the challenges with the beyond visual range missiles, particularly in the Vietnam environment, was a lack of a trustworthy way of doing long-range, beyond visual range identification of targets. So these missiles were initially developed to shoot down, incoming raids of, Soviet bombers at medium to high altitude. They had issues at lower altitude with both their agility and their reliability. You're talking about vacuum tube electronics in the early missiles here, which didn't hold up well in the tropical environment in Vietnam, for example. But what you find is that between 65 and 69, the gun is kind of still ruling. Just a little bit less than 70% of the kills achieved in the late 1960s were achieved with guns. Most of those were achieved by the Israeli Air Force, largely because no one would sell them any air-to-air missiles. So they had to do everything with guns. But as you can see, as you move into the 70s, that begins to change. And the types of weapons that begin to dominate air combat are IR-seeking, rear hemisphere-only types of weapons, like early model Sidewinders. And then you have a very small number of all-aspect missiles, which would be sort of the Sparrow-type weapon. And I believe in the 70s there were maybe 3 beyond visual range kills, 2 by the Israelis, or 2 by the U.S. and 1 by the Israelis, something like that. I'll have to look that up for you. And then we have the other category. What is the other category? The other category is I punched my tanks off and he flew into them. Or, he maneuvered into the ground. Okay, so a lot of that happens here too. So this is sort of the environment that you get really in the early missile era. You have an area where your gun engagement can be effective, and that goes out to about 1,500 feet, 500 yards, something like that. You have an area in which rear aspect only IR missile can be pretty effective. The thing to note here is the cone that one could be in with your IR missile is a lot bigger than the gun area. And so even though it's often pointed out that the Sidewinders and the Sparrows in Vietnam did not perform as advertised in the tests and all of that sort of thing, the place you could be and shoot at the other guy was a lot bigger with the missiles than it was with the guns. The other thing to note here is one of the limitations of the early missiles was that they had a relatively long minimum range. So there are, reports of U.S. pilots kind of in this little white area there, where often, I don't know how often, but because it would be tough to judge, but if you found yourself in that area, you would be in a situation where you're too close to use a missile, but you're too far away to effectively use your gun, and so you find yourself, beaten on the glare shield or something and all frustrated. So all of those things are things that have been worked on by smart engineers over the last 50 years, and we'll talk about how that unfolds. All right, so through the 80s, fighters' ability to do search and targeting over larger areas grows significantly. So what we're looking at here is the Iran-Iraq War, the Falklands War, various fights in Lebanon and Libya and places like that. And what you can see is that, again, we've got a significant number, about 400 kills during this decade. Most of those are actually the Iran-Iraq War. That was a pretty big air war. It's something we don't talk about very much. Both sides were fairly evenly matched in terms of equipment, and there were hundreds of airplanes lost on each side. So there's a couple of good sources on that now. Those of you that flew F-14s in the past will be proud to know that the Iranians were able to operate their airplanes and shot down about 120 Iraqi aircraft with that thing, so including about 55 with AIM-54A Phoenix missiles. And right now, the longest range BVR missile kill I can find is an F-14 versus an Iraqi aircraft in the mid-'80s at 62 nautical miles. So when you're up against sort of a near-peer type of adversary, and you have similar numbers of airplanes in the air, ROE can be relaxed, and often you'll find an ability to shoot at much longer ranges. So that's important to note. The other thing to note here is that, again, the mix of weapon types changes significantly. So you see, just as the rear aspect IR missiles displace the guns, the all-aspect missiles are beginning to displace the rear aspect only, and you get a big increase in the number of BVR weapons being used. And again, that's mostly the Iranians shooting down Iraqi airplanes. The other thing to note is that, as far as I can find, the last time a jet-powered fighter-type airplane shot down another jet-powered fighter-type airplane with a gun was in 1989. It was a Iranian F-4E shooting down an Su-22. So it's been a very long time since anybody gunned anybody down in kind of a fair fight. So this is the environment we were talking about earlier. These are roughly to scale. So you go from kind of a 2 nautical mile, 6 mile across battle space back in the 60s to, by the time you get into the 80s, you're looking at a battle space that's maybe 100 nautical miles across. By the time you start thinking about how far can the organic sensors on board these airplanes see, and how far can the missiles go, particularly if you're up high. There's a network piece that comes into this. In Vietnam, the U.S. attempted to put together an airborne air-to-air combat network. Weren't really successful because of limitations of the EC-121 type airplanes that they were trying to use in the AWACS role. By the 1980s, we had fielded E-3 type airplanes that had very good look-down capability, all the way out to 225 nautical miles. They could see all the way to the ground. So what that gave you was a very good picture of the battle space, and even with just voice networks, what you wind up with as you move into Desert Storm, for example, even before the war started, 4 AWACS orbits could see almost every airfield in Iraq and all the way to the ground for most of those. So they were detecting Iraqi airplanes while they were on takeoff roll, and as a result of that, they were able to say, I know that's hostile because I know where it came from, and immediately declared those guys hostile. So what were the ROE in Desert Storm? They were, if AWACS declares the thing hostile, it's a hostile. If AWACS doesn't declare it hostile, then you had to have 2 independent sources of ID. One of those could be visual, another could be mode 4, IFF, and a third could be a non-cooperative target identification capability that existed on the F-15s for sure. I'm not sure if anybody else had that. Did you guys have that in the 14s, Mark, or can you say? Okay. So the F-15 C models were kind of the only airplanes out there that had the ability to do that, to meet that ROE, and that's why they sent them into Iraq mostly. So with that, we'll talk a little bit about what happened there. There's a detailed sort of debriefing of all of the Allied pilots who shot down an airplane in Desert Storm. It was done by John Dewar back in 1991. And he asked all the relevant questions. Where were you? How fast were you going? Where was the other guy? Who told you where it was, when, all that stuff. And it turns out that 27 of the 33 engagements, AWACS provided the targeting information. So you're looking at about 85% of the time, AWACS said, yeah, that's a hostile guy. Go get him. In 16 of the 33 engagements, you have BVR-type kills. So that's 48% of the kills were BVR. This is important because prior to this, there'd only been about 2 that the U.S. had ever done before, largely because they were concerned about beyond visual range IFF in Vietnam. Most of the airplanes flying in Vietnam were U.S. airplanes. In fact, it's likely that most of the airplanes without a good IFF squawk in Vietnam were probably U.S. airplanes with a broken IFF set. And as a result, you don't want to shoot anything that's just squawking bad IFF. Desert Storm was the same situation. There weren't very many Iraqi airplanes flying around. Most of the airplanes flying were Allied airplanes. And again, it's likely that most of the airplanes with a bad IFF squawk were probably Allied airplanes. What's interesting here is there were no incidents of fratricide in BVR shooting in Desert Storm. And we were confident enough in it that about half the kills we made were BVR. In only 5 of the 17 visual range encounters did U.S. fighters engage in any kind of significant ACM. In many of those situations, the reason for that was they were either tipped off by an AWACS airplane or detected the opposing aircraft at significant ranges and were able to position themselves without having to pull significant Gs and go really fast in an advantageous position so they could kill the guy very quickly. It's also worth noting that I didn't count this as a BVR kill, but I think it kind of is. There's a F-18C pilot who was going to bomb an airfield on the first day of Desert Storm, was tipped off by the E-2 that there were 2 Iraqi MiG-21s headed their way. He detected them on his radar, and at about 8 nautical miles, launched a missile and shot one of them down. He thought he was launching a Sparrow. He actually launched a Sidewinder, which impacted at about 4.5 nautical miles because the incoming MiGs were going supersonic. So given the size of a MiG-21 head-on, there's no way that he could visually, physically see that airplane at the time he launched the weapon. So I bring that up because I'm trying to communicate that I'm trying to be conservative here. I would say that that was a BVR kill, but I didn't count it. In most of the BVR engagements, the U.S. pilots detected the enemy airplanes at about 42 nautical miles, which is about as far as you could detect an airplane with an F-15C radar at that time. And they launched missiles at about 16 nautical miles max and an average of about 10 nautical miles. And that was a weapon limitation. That's as far as the Sparrow would go. If they'd had AMRAAMs, they would have shot further away because they had plenty of time. In a lot of cases, they were just kind of going, okay, I'm just waiting until I can, get into a good firing position here. They fired 22 AIM-7s in the BVR engagements. They fired 28. Of those, 22 either hit the target or they hit the fireball. And when you compare that to the reliability rate back in the 60s, that's about 79%. That's almost 10 times more reliable than the AIM-7s were back in Vietnam in the 60s. So electronics came a long way between 1965 and 1990. You're talking solid-state type electronics, much more reliable, and the weapons had been improved. They were specifically designed to go further, pull more Gs, and of course the AIM-9 was designed to be, in particular, a short-range dogfight weapon. What's really interesting is that at no time did any U.S. airplane exceed 650 knots. It was at 12,000 feet, just barely supersonic. Even when they were going after MiG-25s that were running away on the deck at over 700 knots. So by 91, I would argue that sensors, comms, provided by a voice network, and weapons had come to be at least as important, maybe more important, than traditional platform attributes like speed and agility. All right. So let's see. What am I doing here? All right. Maneuvering into firing position. So what's the battle space look like? Again, this is our little traditional 6 nautical mile battle space. As you get into the late 80s, early 90s, you have airplanes like the F-14 and others that have very long-range radars and can potentially detect you at up to 100 nautical miles and begin to engage you shortly after that. Things continue to improve. The battle space gets bigger, and we have things coming along like data links that vastly improve the ability to move information around inside your air combat network. So unlike the guys who were using voice nets in Desert Storm, you're able to pass Link 16 type information to each other. That further improves the situation. So at the end of the day, where do we wind up? Now, one thing to note is that, since 1990, air-to-air combat's been pretty rare. There's only, I think, something on the order of 70 or so kills, something like that, since 1990. But that's still enough to legally do statistics on, so I did. As you can see, again, beyond visual range weapons tend to dominate that even more than they did in the 80s. No gun kills in there at all. All aspect IR missiles are kind of being smooshed out, and the rear aspect IR missiles are kind of, guys who can't afford anything else, old legacy airplanes, stuff like that. And then, of course, we have the other category, which is the, he flew into my drop tank kind of stuff. All right. So that's the story. Sensors, weapons, network information really are coming to dominate how the outcomes look here. So let's talk a little bit about traditional fighter attributes. And I think this is really important because the nation is at a point right now where we're beginning to think about what comes after F-35. What does a 6th-generation type air superiority platform look like, and how should we think about that? And at the end of this, what I'm going to argue is that we need to take a big step back and not assume that the platform necessarily needs to be 9G capable, supersonic, and all of those sorts of things, because when you talk to airplane designers, they will tell you every one of these attributes you put into the airplane has a cost associated with it. They also have benefits. Everybody got to earn their way on. Speed has to earn its way on. Maneuverability has to earn its way on. All of that. So what are the benefits of speed? Traditionally, one of the big benefits of speed was I could cross that 2-mile detection zone fast enough to where I could surprise the other guy. If I can get across it faster, he has fewer opportunities to detect me coming in to kill him. Obviously, as sensor ranges increase, particularly over the last 50 years, as you just saw, the detection range of sensors has increased many-fold. Fighter aircraft top speed's about the same now as it was in 1965. So the ability of airplanes to cross that detection space has actually decreased in terms of the amount of time it takes you to get across it. So the ability of speed to enable surprise is probably diminishing. Also used to use it to avoid attack. Hey, if I'm faster than you, you can't catch me. I can deny engagement. You could probably still do that. The challenge is that there's other ways to skin that cat now. So to the extent that the other guy has a really big, really long range, really fast missile, he can compensate for the fact that you may be faster than him. Escape and disengage, similar things go there. This is important. This is something that the F-22 guys and the F-15 guys, for that matter, rely on a lot. If I can get high and fast, I can fling my missile farther than you can fling yours. That works if the other guy has a missile that's comparable to yours. There's other ways to skin that cat, right? So if I have 10 times your payload capacity, I can carry missiles that are 3 or 4 times the size of yours. I can carry more of them, and I can use the energy inside the missile instead of the energy of my platform to fling the missile further. So again, it's time to step back, take a really broad look at how we equip our airplanes and inject this air-to-air functionality into the places we're going to need it in the future. Let's talk about the evolving importance of traditional fighter attributes in terms of the cost of speed. So compared to a subsonic airplane with the same range and payload capability, if you buy a supersonic airplane, it's going to be bigger. It's going to be more complex, it's going to be more expensive to build, and it's going to be more expensive to operate and maintain. So there's a monetary cost to that. One of the things that's important to note is that if you actually fly around at supersonic speed, that's going to reduce your range and endurance. It turns out that doesn't have much impact on modern SAM engagement envelopes. So the ground-based threats are capable enough to where how fast you're going is probably not a limitation on their ability to engage you. It also has the potential to dramatically increase your IR detection range through the aerodynamic heating of the edges. So what you see here is my leading edge and shot cone temperature as a function of your Mach. This is sort of how far away can you be detected by a IR seeker of any type. So if a IR seeker could detect you at 25 miles when you're cruising along at 0.8 Mach, it could detect you about 1.7 times as far away if you're doing Mach 1.2. Why? Because the temperature of your edges is significantly warmer. You go from about minus 25, I think, to about plus 40. So that's a challenge. So thinking about this, again, not just in terms of radar stealth and things like that, we got to think about, hey, if I'm going to drive around at supersonic speeds, my airplane's going to be hotter, which means I've got an IR impact on my survivability and on my ability to sneak up and surprise somebody, because what I'm really trying to do here at the end of the day is maintain an SA advantage. So anything I can do to help deny information to the adversary is a good thing. I'm not saying speed is necessarily off the table. I'm just saying you got pluses and minuses. All right. Let's talk a little bit about agility. So in the past, I needed an agile airplane in order to get in plane, in range, in lead during the gun era. I also needed it to avoid weapon parameters. So if I do see you coming to try to kill me, I can maneuver and keep you outside of that relatively small piece of the sky you had to be in relative to my airplane in order to employ weapons on me. As that piece of the sky gets bigger and bigger and bigger, my ability to deny you a firing position decreases commensurately. So it's not clear that being able to turn really hard is going to deny anybody a firing position when they can shoot at you from 50 or 100 or 150 nautical miles away. Endgame maneuvers. Back in the 80s, when I was flying airplanes, we were big on endgame maneuvers because missiles weren't all that maneuverable. In many cases, not all, but in many, that's no longer the case. Airplanes cannot turn circles smaller than the missiles that are being shot at them in many cases. So the utility of maneuverability as a last-ditch defense is decreasing. So what are the costs? I mean, if this is free, I'll put it on my airplane anyway because it might be useful. Turns out it's not. I got to have a stronger structure to withstand increased G loads. So if I have a 3G airplane instead of a 9G airplane, the structure, at least to first order, is going to be about 3 times heavier for the one that's a 9G airplane. Why? Because it's got to support 3 times the weight. So how do I get back the lost capacity? I have to either reduce my payload or my fuel if I want to keep the airplane the same takeoff weight, or if I want to maintain the same range and payload, I got to build a bigger airplane. So either way, there's a cost to pay there from an airplane design perspective. Also, usually requires some kind of large control surfaces, vertical tails, for high AOA maneuvering. That tends to have a negative impact on your radar cross-section, particularly to the sides. So there's a survivability potential benefit. I can maybe outmaneuver something. On the other hand, my signature may get bumped up on the sides. That may be a survivability minus. Again, it's time to do some real hard analysis and look at this in a very objective way to see which of those kind of wins out. Thrust vector control is another way you could try to skin this cat, and that may be better and may help you with the radar cross-section issue. But again, that adds weight and complexity to your design as well. So in airplane design, there's no free lunch, turns out. Maneuverability, generally you also want a high thrust-to-weight ratio and a low wing loading. And you also want, not just low wing loading, but generally you want to have a relatively low aspect ratio, because as the wings get long and thin, your ability to keep them stiff enough and strong enough to support loads goes away. So what that tends to do is reduce your propulsion efficiency. Why? Because my engines are no longer sized to be efficient at cruise speed. They're sized to give me the maximum thrust that I can possibly get out of them, so I can maintain high energy maneuverability characteristics. And the wing loading issue, or more accurately, the wing aspect ratio issue, decreases the aerodynamic efficiency of the airplane overall. So again, as you get into this, there are real trades that you have to make in order to include these attributes in whatever future air-to-air type platform you're thinking about. Let's see. All right, let's talk a little bit about the prospects for visual range conflict or combat. Modern visual range combat, I would argue, is very dangerous, even for airplanes like F-22. It's a very maneuverable airplane, has thrust vectoring and all of that sort of thing. One of the challenges that I think we're going to see probably over the next decade or so, as high off-bore sight, lock-on after launch, missiles with extreme maneuverability, the missiles have thrust vector control too, as those begin to proliferate, particularly as they have countermeasure resistant seekers that tend to be focal plane arrays, which actually take an image of the thing you're shooting at. It's not just looking for hot metal anymore. It's aiming for a thing that looks like an airplane. It's much more difficult to decoy it. And if I can look over my shoulder and see you, I can shoot you. If both airplanes have a missile in the air, and it's likely that they will in a situation like that, then what you're likely to see is an increasing prevalence of mutual kills in this kind of environment. And that, another way of describing mutual kill is something approaching a 1-to-1 kill ratio. So for the U.S. military and our allies, we tend not to have large numbers of things, and the people that we're fighting often tend to have larger number of things. If that's true, then a 1-to-1 kill ratio is not going to be too helpful for us. So going to the merge may not be a desirable thing to do, even if you're in a very capable airplane. It's probably something that you want to try to avoid at all costs, because you may not be bringing that airplane back. As we've all talked about before, even things like F-22, fantastic platform, just doesn't exist in large numbers, so please try not to lose them. This is an interesting comment. Take it for what it's worth. German colonel who has been in exercises with F-22s says they're very difficult to deal with in the beyond visual range realm, but once we get in close, hey, my Typhoon does pretty much as well as the F-22 in a close fight. So I'm not as scared of them there when we get in close. Just take it for what it's worth then. Something that really concerns me, particularly as we think about things like the pivot to the Pacific and where our long and enduring national security problems are likely to be focused over the coming decades, is the mismatch that we currently have between our fighter combat radius and our bomber combat radii. We're going to depend increasingly on bombers to provide a lot of our firepower in areas where there aren't very many bases, and the ones that do exist, close enough to be efficient for fighter operations, are going to tend to be under severe threats. So what am I going to do? Well, I'd like to escort my bombers if I could, if I'm up against somebody who has a lot of fighter planes, but I've got a challenge, and that is that my fighter aircraft combat radius is significantly shorter than my bomber aircraft combat radius. And if my bombers can't go anywhere, my fighters can't go, then what am I doing this for, right? So we're going to have to move the air-to-air functionality to where it needs to be in terms of applying that combat power at range. Another thing to note, just an interesting fact, empty weight of a F-22 is about 10% more than a B-17G. Fighters are big. They're really, really capable, but I mean, it's a 40,000-pound airplane empty. So it's important to think about what an airplane with F-22 type performance characteristics would look like if you wanted it to go 2 or 3 or 4 times as far as the F-22 can go. And that tends to look like an airplane that gets to be very, very large. And the distinction between that and the empty weight of the sort of theater type bombers we're talking about rapidly goes away too. So, and by the way, industry tends to sell airplanes by the pound, empty weight, so that gets expensive as well. All right, enough of that. So this is what really kind of concerns me. F-22, the program actually started in the early 1980s, and the idea for the mission was that it would be able to cover most of the relevant targets in a Central European scenario. 400-ish nautical mile combat radius did that very well. If you pick that 400 nautical mile combat radius up from the Central European theater as it existed back in the 80s and drop it down in the Pacific and base those guys on Guam, you can see that they can't, without refueling, go anywhere besides Guam or other parts of the Marianas. If you do refuel them, and you want to make sure that your refueling operation is not disrupted by periodic adversary fighter sweeps and things like that, you're probably going to have to conduct that somewhere between 500 and 700 nautical miles off the coast of China. So the challenge with that is that the F-22 combat radius is right now about 410 nautical miles, which means I can't go feet dry, which means I can't escort bombers to blow anything up. So again, how do we get to the point where we can provide some air-to-air functionality for our bomber airplanes that are probably going to have to go 1,000, 1,200, 1,500 nautical miles from the tanker in order to accomplish anything that's going to provide a deterrent against the Chinese and allow us to address the target sets and all of that. I would argue that as we go forward, the basic goal of air-to-air combat stays the same. I want to sneak up on the bad guy. I want to kill him before he knows I'm there. And I want to get out before his friends can react. That's first look, first shot, first kill. With virtually all of the engagements at BVR ranges already, you can probably, it's at least based on the trends, it looks like BVR is the way of the future. So in a BVR world, what does first look, first shot, first kill look like? I want to be able to detect, ID, and target the enemy first. Again, this goes back to situational awareness. So how do I do that? I need long range, which means large, multi-phenomenology sensors. I want to have radars. I want to have IR, UV, whatever I can get, but I want large apertures because I want to be able to see as far as I can. The sort of leveling of the technological playing field is going to make this more important because if the other guy has things like AESA radars and stuff like that, you're going to need a bigger one because you probably can't count on having one that's a lot better than the other guys. IR sensors are going to be increasingly prominent, I would argue, for a couple of reasons. One is they're passive. So again, in the battle for SA, I like passive sensors because I'm not emitting stuff because that can be detected. And they're also not vulnerable to advanced radar jamming techniques and things like that. In the radar realm, you're always in a move, counter-move kind of situation. You don't know who had the last move. Therefore, you never know for sure when the conflict starts or during the conflict how well your sensors are going to work on any given day. Radar is still going to be important for a variety of reasons, not least of which is determining range, mid-course missile guidance, and of course you can use those apertures to do things like act as electronic countermeasures, emitters, and things like that too. what else do I want? I want a minimum all-aspect, broadband radar signature. So let's talk about what that means. I want to be able to minimize my signature in all aspects, all around me, so that I don't get detected. And I want to do that across as much of the radar spectrum as I possibly can. So that's all aspect and broadband. And that's going to drive you to airplanes that kind of have a specific shape, and they're going to tend to look more like flying wings than traditional pointy fighter airplanes. I want a minimum IR signature, which means I'm probably not going to fly around supersonic a lot because that heats me up. And I want robust line-of-sight networks because I'm not going to be able to take AWACS with me. I'm going to need to communicate with as many friends around me as possible in order to, again, win the battle for SA. So where does this drive us? This is kind of the big heretical thing. Everybody's probably already figured this out by now. No analogy is perfect, but this one I'll throw out there anyway. For a very long time, big ships were not scared of small ships. Why? They had taller masts. They could see the smaller ship before the small ship could see them. If they, for whatever reason, couldn't get away from the smaller ship, their guns outranged the smaller ship, and the guns on the smaller ship couldn't hurt the big ship. That's where the analogy falls apart a little bit because for a long time, well, since the beginning of air combat, small airplanes have always been able to hurt big airplanes because of the inherent fragility of airplanes. But I would argue that much of the analogy does hold. If I can see you first and shoot you first, I can probably kill you because of the inherent fragility of airplanes. So those are the sorts of things we're going to have to think about as we go forward. We'll talk too much more about that. So the question is, and this is the, again, the big heresy, is the day of the big warplane about to arrive? If you're really talking about increasing capabilities for electronic sensors, networks, long-range weapons being the keys to winning in the future, and if BVR is a prevailing form of combat, maybe I actually do want more space, weight, and power for my sensors, my networks, and eventually DE weapons are going to show up, right? So for any given level of DE technology, I can always carry and cool a bigger DE weapon on my big airplane than you can carry on your small airplane, which means I can always outrange you. So to the extent that that stuff actually does show up in the 2030, 2040 time frame, which is what we're talking about when we get to the 6th gen world, and we're talking about airplanes that are likely to be in service into the 2070s or 2080s at the way that we replace them, DE is a real consideration here. That stuff's coming. And it doesn't matter how fast you're going or how many G's you're pulling, the little laser beam's going to hit you. So you need to be able to kill the other guy or poke his eyes out first. So in the future, if you've got bigger sensors, better, longer-range weapons, you can probably beat the other guy first. And I have a cartoon of this. So again, this is just a cartoon. It's sort of a concept of how this might work. What I have here is a large manned airplane with line-of-sight links to smaller, with less payload type unmanned airplanes, which you might think of as airborne pickets. One of their major jobs is to provide some of the network functionality that you would otherwise get out of sort of an AWACS platform, which can't be here because it's deep in bad guy land. If you've got enemy fighters cruising along at Mach 1.8 because they're coming to kill you, what does that look like? Based on the unclassified detection ranges for targets at 0.8 Mach for the existing pirate system in Janes, this is what the detection ranges of those airplanes look like. So the bigger guy, why does he have a bigger detection range? He's got a bigger surface area. So IR detection range, there's another trade-off. Big means more area, more emittance. The smaller guys, less area, less detection range. Those guys over there are really hot, so I'm going to be able to detect them much further away. As you get further into this, what's going to happen is at this point, I've got multiple little picket guys that can detect each one of those bad guy airplanes. If I've got a really good line-of-sight network, which is going to be pretty hard to jam, I can fuse that information and get coordinates that are good enough to launch weapons on them at a significant range. My little guy's turn to delay the merge. The big guy launches missiles, and if you shoot 2 missiles per bad guy with a 0.5 PK, what you're going to wind up with is 75% of the bad guy airplanes get killed on average, and if I did my math right, that leaves 2. So far, they have not yet detected a blue airplane. Now, it depends on how brave those last 2 guys are. If they decide to keep coming, then we've got some options. We can award them some more long-range missiles, or we can let the little guys shoot them down with AMRAAM-class weapons, because, again, the little guys haven't been detected yet. So just for fun, we're going to let the little guys do it, because they can carry AMRAAM-class weapons to defend themselves. So what does that look like? Well, again, if you shoot 2 weapons per guy, on average, I'm going to shoot down 1.5 of those guys, so I'm going to round that up to 2. And at the end, what you wind up with is I've still got 8 very long-range air-to-air missiles on board my big airplane, and I've only launched 4 of my 24 missiles out of the little guys. So I've still got a pretty deep missile magazine, and I just shot down 8 bad guy, high-end, super cruising, really cool fighter planes without being detected. So that is at least a vision of what we might want to think about in terms of what does 6th gen really look like at the end of the day. It's first look, first shot, first kill, and I think I'm stealing my thunder from my conclusion slide. So superior situational awareness really always has been the key to success in air combat. We tend to focus a lot on platforms. I think we need to focus more on the fact that what really wins the battle is knowing more about where everybody is than the other guy. Weapon performance determines your engagement envelope, which determines how close you got to get to the other guy. So to the extent that I can stay further away and still know more about him than he knows about me, that's the key to success. In the gun and early missile era, speed and agility were crucial. Why? Weapons couldn't go that far, and they weren't that accurate, so I had to have my airplane in a very specific piece of the sky in order to shoot somebody. That's no longer the case. So we need to think about what are the implications of that for the attributes I want in my air-to-air airplanes. In the missile area, we did the statistical analysis of the 1,400-ish, not 1,500, 1,400 plus, combat victories. Improvements in sensor range, missile range, reliability, and networks vastly improved over the last 50 years. If you think about the improvements in computer systems, communications, sensors, and things like that, relative to the aerodynamic performance of fighter aircraft over the last 50 years, the electronics are really winning. So it's important to think about what that means as we go into the future, because that's probably not going to change, because Moore's Law is still working. Most kills over the last 20 years were achieved with long-range weapons, minimal maneuvering. That's probably going to continue and maybe be even more prevalent in the future. And again, it's time to step back, think about what are those attributes I want to design into my 6th gen thing, whatever that is. And those may be quite different from the way we've thought about air superiority platforms in the past 100 years or so. I think, if I'm lucky, this will move forward. Any questions? Go ahead.
Excellent brief. Excellent brief. George Nicholson, a special operations consultant. About 3 years ago, Lieutenant General Deptula gave a briefing at AFA, talked about the future. And it's an unclassified briefing. You can look at it online. But you've talked about the blue side.
Yes.
But he talked about the red side.
Absolutely.
What the Russians are doing, what the Chinese, the sensors they're going to have on their aircraft,
yes,
being able to detect the F-22 before the F-22 even knows that we're out there. Their air-to-air capability going to far exceed anything we've got. And the other thing, and it brings up what's been announced in the last couple of days, is the thing you didn't even mention, is items like the S-300. The Russians have announced they're going to sell it to Iran right now. They've announced in 2016 they're going to probably start exporting the S-400.
Yes.
They're developing the S-500, particularly to take out J-Stars, AWACS,
right,
Hawkeye, and our tankers. How does that all fit into this whole concept?
That's a great question. The focus here really was on the air-to-air piece. Lots of people, as you mentioned, are looking at the ground-based threat to air operations, and it's we're probably on the cusp now of really seeing the sorts of things that we've been worried about for a while in terms of proliferation of advanced ground-based air defenses. that has serious implications for our fourth-gen airplanes and even for the fifth-generation airplanes. What it can do, as you pointed out, is push back your enablers, right? So if they're able to push back the AWACS and push back the tankers and things like that several hundred nautical miles, then and you only have a 400 or 500 or 600 nautical mile combat radius off the tanker, then what you're limited to is kind of working around the edges for some significant period of time till you can do something about those ground-based air defenses. So that, I think, tends to drive you even more into the realm of how do I minimize my signatures and deal with those guys in other ways. I don't want to get into things I shouldn't talk about in public, but I think you're going to wind up, as we look at this in more detail, particularly given the increased utility of long-range operations, you're going to wind up looking at, again, larger airplanes where you try to minimize your detectability by a combination of things. One of my colleagues is a submariner, Brian Clark, and there are new technologies out there that allow detection of even the quietest submarine, called low-frequency active array. It's an active underwater sensor system that can detect even the quietest submarines at significant ranges. So the submarine community is facing some of the same challenges as the aircraft community when it comes to detectability. What I like to say is that, all right, so there's a way that you can detect a quiet submarine. That doesn't mean you can go back to building loud submarines, right? Because there's already ways to detect loud submarines. The same applies with airplanes. Just because there may be ways to detect a stealthy airplane doesn't mean I can go back to building non-stealthy airplanes. It means I have to use stealth plus something else. That's what the Navy has to do with their submarines. That's what we're going to have to do in the air. We're going to have to use, we're going to have to minimize our signatures to the extent that we can, and then we're going to have to use active ECM measures and things like that, or off-board support or whatever to make up the difference, I think is ultimately where we're going to have to go. So, over here.
Kurt Bedke, Air Force retired. Have you thought about what you see as the proper role in the future of the man in this system? And is it inside the cockpit or is it outside?
And again, that's a great question. I think certainly an example I gave you here, I've got an airplane with a human crew that's sort of doing the battle management and control forward, so I don't have to pipe all this stuff back. And by the way, I'm not even in that little network that we showed, it's not 4 channels of HD video. What you're really trading there is digital information about where I think the other guy is. And that's not huge amounts of data that you have to pass all the time. It's not gigabits of data or anything. It's fairly manageable. So I think something like what you saw there, where you have a human crew that's supported by off-board unmanned systems, is probably one way that you could see this evolve, and it's probably one of the more implementable ways where I don't have to reach back huge, thousands and thousands of miles to try and control this battle, and it's not dependent on space systems and all that sort of stuff. So I think that may be one way to do it. You have a manned-unmanned team, at least initially. So we had some over here. Go ahead.
Joe Limber, also a retired Air Force. Echoing the comment here, I've got to assume that there's a copy of this in Beijing and Moscow right now. Oh, they're probably inside your networks, and they probably got it before we did.
It's on the internet, so I'm sure they have it.
So there you go. So assuming that they're reading this, the vignette that you presented at the end showed their fighters coming out of 1.8 Mach.
Right.
I've got to assume they're going to read this and say, wow, that's probably not a good idea. And they're going to implement some of the lessons you're presenting here. So to what extent does our long-range engagement capability actually start to fall away and drive us back to the shorter-range engagements that we saw historically, especially the advent of passive engagements and whatnot, millimeter wave seekers? We're having a harder and harder time detecting the threat out there. How do we improve our threat awareness? You started off by saying that threat awareness is the key. We don't have it. Is that where we really need to focus?
another way of putting it, I guess, is to say, all right, as the technological playing field tends to become more level, how are we going to maintain an advantage? I don't know how to do that indefinitely into the future, but I do believe that the U.S., at least right now, has a significant advantage in building the types of airplanes that I showed you at the end here. Nobody else is building airplanes that look like that or has any experience doing it. So that's one. The second is, again, I think we're going to have to build sensors that are, very agile, can probably adapt within a mission. You're going to see, guys on the other side. They're going to have the ability to kind of do, real-time ECM development. During the mission, we're going to have to change our waveforms for active sensors, and we're going to need passive sensors that can see farther than the other guys. And the only way that, based on the physics of passive sensors, the only way to do that is have a bigger aperture than the other guy has, and that means, space, weight, power, cooling. I got to have a bigger airplane somewhere in order to do that. And it's got to be survivable because it can't be on a 707 anymore because those things can't get close enough to the fight to provide that. So, anybody else?
John, I think.
Are we done?
Yeah, I would
Right
ask
on
you
time.
if you do want to stick around and ask John some more questions. Feel free to use this room, but we have concluded our allotted time.
Thanks.
John, on behalf of Mitchell and AFA, I want to thank you very much for your time and for your briefing today. I'd like to provide this book of Air Commanders for your time.
Oh, thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thanks, everyone.
A quick announcement. Our next Mitchell Forum will be on April 29th. We have the Air Force Assistant Vice Chief of Staff, Lieutenant General Stephen Hogue, here. He'll be talking about current issues facing the United States Air Force. I'd also like to mention that Mitchell is holding their annual Aerospace Forum in New York City on May 12th with the Air Force Chief of Staff, General Mark Welsh, serving as the keynote speaker. You can get online if you want information about how to attend that. Thanks, everybody.